Welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to the first installment of the season's talk series on Kenny Goldsmith, Allison Knowles, and others at the White House, and about the Avant-Garde, the White House, and all things related. So at this time, I'd like to invite our panelists to come join me at the front. Stephen Zultanski, who is the author of Pad and Cop Kisser. He co-curates the Segway Reading Series and is editing the volume of critical writing of conceptual writing with Vanessa Place and Darren Marshler. Sandra Simonds, who grew up in Los Angeles, California, and received a BA in psychology and creative writing at UCLA and an MFA from the University of Montana, where she received a poetry fellowship. Her second book of poetry, Mother Was a Tragic Girl, will be published by Cleveland State University Poetry Center in 2012. She is the author of Warsaw Bikini, which was a finalist for numerous prizes, including the National Poetry Series. She is also the author of several chapbooks, including Used White Wife and The Humble Travelogues of Mr. Ian Worthington, written from land and sea. Finally, Rod Smith, who's the author of Deed, Music or Honesty, Protective Immediacy, and In Memory of My Theories. He edits the journal Ariel, publishes Edge Books, and manages Bridge Street Books in Washington, D.C. He is also editing the selected letters of Robert Creeley with Kaplan Harris and Peter Baker for the University of California Press.
I decided to frame my talk specifically around Goldsmith at the White House, partially just because it seemed to me that's what was on the tip of everybody's tongue. It seemed like the debate focused on him, and not as many people were talking about Knowles or the other poets for various reasons. So 7 arguments and a conclusion read Kenneth Goldsmith's White House visit. Argument 1, we have something to discuss. Kenneth Goldsmith's trip to the White House functions as an opportunity to revisit an old debate about the relationship between avant-garde art and politics. Perhaps you think this debate is not so much a debate as it is a hackneyed series of grad student cliches. Perhaps you think there is no relationship between the two terms. Or perhaps you think that there's no longer any such thing as an avant-garde, and that such militaristic terminology has regrettably outlived the historical practice it describes. That's cool. You can think all that all you want. But my position tonight will be that there is a debate about avant-garde and politics. There is a relation between the two terms, and there is a field of living artistic practices organized under the name avant-garde. My evidence for this position is simple. 1, people continue to debate about the relationship between avant-garde art and politics. Therefore, it's still a debate. 2, if there's an ongoing debate, then there's an ongoing relationship, even if we define this relationship in the end as a non-relation. And 3, new work is still produced under the sign of the avant-garde, i.e. writers and artists still use the term to define and clarify what they do. And thus, the terminology and concept remains an operative force in contemporary art and writing. So this whole first argument is just to state that I think there is something called an avant-garde versus those who claim it's historically over, etc., even though it continues to still function and operate. Argument 2. Goldsmith is an avant-garde writer. This hinges on how one characterizes the notion of an avant-garde. On the one hand, you have those who understand avant-garde work to be that which is resistant to institutional assimilation. That is, the avant-garde always remains firmly outside of moneyed institutions, usually conceived of as trade publishers, universities, and galleries, and thus functions as an oppositional force to the power of these institutions. On the other hand, you have those who understand the avant-garde as that which opens up new possibilities for artistic practice, broadly conceived. That is, the avant-garde expands that which is understood to be art, thereby forcing into existence works which would have previously been impossible or illegible. Are these two positions mutually exclusive? Actually, yes. The first requires the isolation of the work. It must remain an aberration in the constellation of contemporary writing in order to successfully resist institutional power. That is, it must remain as something like totally unassimilable to the rest of contemporary writing. The second position, on the other hand, must actively create a proliferation of new works, which render each other retroactively legible. This will result in some degree of cultural assimilation, regardless of the initial radicality of the form or politics of the work, but will also result in the continuing disruption of this assimilation by the introduction of formal and political deviations. I'll summarize this with a gross simplification. Goldsmith's work has opened up new possibilities in the writing of poetry. In this room alone, there are a number of people whose recent work would simply not have been possible without Goldsmith's writing, even though it does not resemble his writing. Argument 3, things change. Aaron Winslow suggested that this talk address in some way the changes in political climate since May. Specifically, he thought I should address the way Occupy Wall Street has perhaps shifted our perspective, i.e., in May, our notion of a political art was necessarily divorced from movement politics, and now it's possible to imagine these things as connected. At first, I resisted the urge to bring current events into this talk, as it seemed too topical in a corny, opportunist way. But Aaron's right. OWS has, for many of us, changed the field of political possibility and involvement, and this change should be reflected in our theorization of the relation between art and politics. But I hope I'm not going to say what you think I'm going to say. What I think you think I'm going to say is something like this. Now that there's a movement, we can link our writing to that movement and allow our artwork to be led by our political work or vice versa. That's not what I'm going to say. Instead, I'd like to focus on the way OWS has incorporated non-work into its design. Much has been made of its failure to issue demands, but this, of course, has been the movement's strength. In fact, the internal struggle of the movement itself has not been to clarify or to decide on demands, but rather the opposite. The struggle has been against those who too quickly want to organize everything in the name of a few demands, union leaders, Democrats, ISO types, etc. In other words, there has been a struggle to wait. The daily work of the meetings has been to forestall those who demand to see immediate political efficacy in the form of legible and often electoral politics. Instead, there has been a collective push to clarify the movement in practice, in local struggles, actions, meetings, and marches, as opposed to in some sort of generalized platform. Such local clarifications cannot and will not result in politics as we know it, but in some mutant form that hopefully will inspire other mutant forms. This has been a cognitive rewiring for many activists who are otherwise application-minded. Instead of focusing on what we can do, we focus on what not to do. I'm not saying, of course, that this is just like the practice of avant-garde literature, which forestalls instrumentalization. Instead, I'd like to propose it as a metaphor, in a strong sense of the word, as both a non-relation and a semblance. Argument 4, the avant-garde never quite works. Whatever else the avant-garde does, it certainly doesn't work. Everybody knows this. The political ineffectivity of formally experimental art and literature has been much decried. Clearly, new art has not produced a new world. Already in 1968, Renato Puglioli's theory of the avant-garde made the case that avant-gardist tendencies were borrowed from radical political movements of 19th century Europe, displacing political action with the semblance of revolution in art. Since Puglioli, this argument has become a commonplace. The idea that avant-garde art is modeled on world-changing and fails because it fails to change the world is used to dismiss the very notion of artistic experimentation and to return to writing practices that uphold normality. I'd like to bring into play an essay by Werner Hammacher entitled Working Through Working, in which he close reads a couple of Nazi philosophers, Junger, Heidegger, and Hitler, on the concept of work. Perhaps unsurprisingly, all these thinkers agree that man creates himself through work. In other words, the essence of man is an auto-production of the self through his working. Hammacher points out that this is also the notion of work received through capitalist ideology, in which one becomes oneself through hard work. Work is conceived here as a self-fashioning, a purging of the other in the attempt to become whole, immortal, and purely oneself. It is, in Hammacher's words, a monumentalization of the autonomy of self at the cost of all others. So instead of imagining work to be that which works against or on the other, Hammacher wants to elaborate a concept of work that's grounded on the other of work, that is, on non-work. His example of such a practice is gleaned from Freud. The work of transference, insofar as it involves a certain waiting, a struggle to wait, presents an obstacle to treatment while driving it forward. This forestalls the immediacy of interpretation and instead allows for the contingency of the path of the unconscious. I offer this summary of Hammacher in this reference to Freud again metaphorically. It's not as if I believe that the writing of poetry is somehow like clinical psychoanalysis. That's crazy. But that psychoanalysis teaches us something crucial about non-work, which defines avant-garde practice. Those angered by Goldsmith's visit to the White House are angry because it proves that the avant-garde does not work for them. They are angry because it is not auto-productive of a self-present political subject. Argument 5. We should not imagine that the personal politics of the author are somehow coincident to the politics of the work. Argument 6. The role of the avant-garde is not to present the brute materiality of the world, but to take an aesthetic position which can then be negated. With argument 5 in mind, politics of the author, not coincident with the politics of the work, we also shouldn't reduce the author or the text to mere inert material. In Vanessa Place's essay on Goldsmith at the White House, she attempts to take the death of the author one step further and argues for the death of the text. By this she means that appropriation writing functions as radical mimesis, which manifests the pure materiality of the text, that is, its status as matter, which allows for its malleability. And this is a quote from her. It is nothing more than dumb materiality, a mute object that can serve, like other hunks of stuff, our man-made need for talismans. But this argument, in my opinion, is too realistic. While it may be true that text can be theorized as mute materiality, it's not true that they can ever appear as such. In other words, Goldsmith's work may highlight the sheer bulk of words between the covers of the book, but the words can never appear as a simple quantity. Rather, they are experienced in a certain system of meaning overdetermined within a cultural and artistic context. Thus, the focus on the dumb materiality of language corresponds to a fantasy of elemental experience, in which the very thingness of a thing, in this case language, appears without the mediation of the symbolic. However, Place uses this argument to then say that we should return to the problem of aesthetics. And here I could not be in more agreement. Sure, the anger over Goldsmith's visit to the White House is at least partly born of moralism, but it's also part of a larger attack on aesthetics as such. What I mean by this is that in the current moment, we are not supposed to be boxed in by an aesthetic. We're supposed to be, any sort of like position taking closes down the conversation. So we are supposed to be like open to everything and anything at all times. However, the staking out of an aesthetic position prevents the work from working, or it unworks the work. When an author makes a clear aesthetic statement in theory or practice, he or she always highlights, inadvertently or not, the failure of that aesthetic. That is, the aesthetic will never live up to itself. It will always fail, and that's the way you have to make it fail, by proposing it in the first place. But our artistic moment's dominant ideology of pluralistic inclusion does not allow for that failure. If all works simply exist in a complex relation, which is for some reason interesting to map, then the work of the works is simply to map the present, which they cannot fail to do, because they are present. But as soon as an aesthetic agenda is opposed to others and given its own work to do, it doesn't do it. It will fail. Let me be clear. I am not arguing that Goldsmith's writing, or conceptual writing more generally, is the only living avant-garde. Far from it. I am merely arguing that each avant-garde is marked by a specific aesthetic practice/theory, which always fails to fully realize itself, and this failure is what disallows its identity with concurrent historical forms, even if presented at the White House. Argument 7, conceptual writing fails. Last night, I was complaining to Rob Fetterman about a passage in Goldsmith's new book of criticism on creative writing. The passage in question argues that, while identity is rendered more fluid by technology and urbanization, there are nonetheless authentic stories by which we are still moved. The story Goldsmith chooses is from a speech by Obama, in which he narrates his grandfather's trials and tribulations as a poor boy in Kenya and his family's eventual stupendous success in the United States. What is Kenny thinking, I asked Rob. Why would he include this hackneyed bootstrap success story as an example of an authentic experience? He really has been hanging out with Perloff too much. But no, Rob pointed out that the previous paragraphs denounce the very idea of an authentic story. Furthermore, the previous chapter suggests that the reframing of political texts is in some ways a more damning critique of them than an essayistic critique, because it lays bare the stupidity and inauthenticity of the politician's speech. Rob is right. Goldsmith's inclusion of Obama's inspiring story rings false because it presents the falseness of the story. By foregoing the obligatory critique, the story appears in all its silliness, as opposed to appearing as an example of silliness as chosen by a clever and morally superior author. The interesting problem is the failure of Goldsmith's critique to fully function as a critique. We can see what he's attempting, but it doesn't quite work because the sheen of his journalistic prose cannot ironize his gesture. Taking this into account, we can invert the common critique of conceptualism and use that critique to affirm its aesthetic. The common critique claims, that the reframing of text without explicit criticism only reproduces dominant ideologies, as opposed to opposing them. To this we must say, yep, the failure of conceptual writing is its failure to do the work it purports to do. But this failure also marks its success. Other poetic projects, which may take a more overtly political or critical stance, often end up working too well. The readers understand the stance, which pre-exists the poem, and can respond accordingly. As such, these works do not necessarily trouble the work of work. Conclusion. I decided not to really talk about the White House visit itself, because it seems, in retrospect, like a non-event. Those who were excited to see avant-garde ideas presented on a grand stage, and those who felt that this was a sign of conceptual writing's deadly institutionalization, were both kind of wrong. The visit really didn't have much of an effect. Conceptual writing is no more institutionalized, published, or taught than it was before. But, as I said, the moment does present us with an opportunity to clarify some things as we move forward, by which I mean as we experiment and write the poems that pass through conceptualism, but which are no longer conceptual. While we do so, a big temptation will be to politicize our writing in the form of institutional critique or movement politics. In other words, to take what Goldsmith's done and to make it work. But I'd like to propose that we take Goldsmith's example of a hard aesthetic position with ambiguous ends seriously. With it, we may attempt to stake out new positions, and in this way, we encounter those obstacles which will drive us on. Finally, I'd like to distinguish this position from the usual valorization of non-instrumentality. To my mind, this position is the obverse of an instrumentalization approach to poetry. To the instrumentalist, poetry does a particular kind of personal/political work, and to the non-instrumentalist, it eschews this work. But in both cases, poetry succeeds at what it is trying to do, either work or play. My position is that the work must attempt something. The poem must attempt something, must attempt to work, at which it can fail, thereby producing unexpected consequences and forms. This is an instrumentality grounded on non-instrumentality. And I'm kind of getting this from the beginning of Bataille's inner experience, in which he writes that he wants to write a book without a project, but in his attempt to write a book without a project, he realized that just writing randomly created a project that always succeeded, and so he needed to write a philosophical project that would fail, and the failure of this project would be the only realization of a non-project. That's it.
So I did talk a little bit more about the White House, I think, so I think this will work out well. And I thought, since the subject of the panel is so broad in the terms that are going to be used, or you have to define them all and stuff like that, I tried to narrow the subject a little bit. So I'm mainly going to be looking at some of the history of poets at the White House, okay, and the potential position of the poet with respect to nation building or nationalism. And then I'm going to move into talking about Kenneth Goldsmith's writing. And now I feel bad that I hope someone's going to talk about Allison Knowles, but well. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question that has been on my mind in the months that I've been thinking about poetry and its relationship to nation. And that's the question Lynn Dinh posed in an exchange with Al Filreis. Is that how you say his name? Al Filreis. It was, I think it really gets at the heart of what a person would ask in considering one's ethical and political commitments, and the intersection of those commitments with what one perceives one's role to be as a poet working within a nation, and how there might exist a potential for a poetry of resistance. And the question that Dinh poses, did Brecht dance for Hitler? Probably everyone here has heard that. Of course, there was a lot of ensuing outrage and discussion prompted by this question. But I think even if it's hyperbolic and perhaps a little bit of a flawed analogy comparing Obama to Hitler, I still think it's an important question because it addresses the poet as a political person rather than an artist who simply makes aesthetic choices in an ivory tower removed from society. And it locates political responsibility outside of the artwork and forces all of us, I think, as poets to ask ourselves the hypothetical question that if we were given an invitation to the White House, how we would respond. Is it possible that we are all of us, whether we're writing more conventional poems or avant-garde poems, writing pieces that can be easily and immediately institutionalized and used by the state to be exhibited as examples of American culture? Are we all writing military propaganda unknowingly? Are we at a point in history where resistance is immediately co-opted? And when we opt out of these invitations, I haven't gotten an invitation yet, but have we cut ourselves off from any chance to use the platform of the state as a way to, quote, speak truth to power? Can even the most non-traditional works of poetry being written entertain the corporate and political elite of our age? So I think Din's construction, what's important about it is not whether Hitler is analogous to Obama, but rather the underlying imperative that we should be thinking about the poet's relationship with the nation and the relationship of political power to works of art. Since Din brought up Hitler, I thought it would be good to juxtapose the White House Poetry Jam with Hitler's 1937 Degenerate Art exhibit to see the different relationship of art to the nation. At the Degenerate Art exhibit, thousands of confiscated modernist paintings were put on display, probably everyone knows this, as examples of Jewish and Bolshevik, other perceived polluting influences on German culture. And it's also worth noting the incredible popularity of the exhibit. 2 million German citizens attended. So if anything, from the massive attendance of the event, we see the power and interest from the state in modern art that resisted traditional forms. The same year of the exhibit, Picasso's Guernica was on display in Paris, and it was, of course, publicly denounced by Hitler. That's not too surprising. And I think I thought this was interesting, that a tapestry of Guernica, which hung at the UN building, was covered up by a UN banner in 2003 when the US was arguing the case for going to war with Iraq. And when Colin Powell completed his 85-minute presentation to the Security Council, he and its members walked out into the second floor hallway past the covered tapestry, covered Guernica. And when the UN was asked why the painting was covered up with a banner, a spokesman responded sort of ridiculously that it was because the horse was distracting. Is this common knowledge? I don't know how many people know this story. Okay, so we know, of course, that the horse isn't the issue. It's the power of the anti-war message thoroughly imbued in the piece, known by all. And it just made me think about why a copy of a piece of art made 75 years ago that's been subjected to mass distribution seems to be more politically powerful, at least distasteful, than the poetry that was read at the White House. So I bring up this UN cover up because it does mark a difference, I think, in the style of the Bush administration's relationship to art when compared with the Obama administration style. I really emphasize the word style here. The Bush administration's response to art was often to cover it up or to cancel literary events when it became clear that they would become politicized. While the tone of the Obama administration's relationship to art is what one might call welcoming. For example, the White House said that the hope of the White House Poetry Jam was to, quote, help ensure that all voices are heard, particularly voices that are not often heard. Yes, Kenny's voice. Of course, there are a few American poets who have refused invitations from the White House, most notably Sharon Olds and Sam Hamill. And there are some notable differences between Obama's White House Poetry Jam when one compares it to Laura Bush's 2003 canceled event, which was entitled Poetry and the American Voice. And that was going to be a symposium on Walt Whitman, Langston Hughes, and Emily Dickinson. As you might recall, it was canceled due to the fact that the White House got wind not only of Sam Hamill's refusal to attend to protest the Iraq invasion, but his intention to deliver a collection of anti-war poems to the White House, a collection which would later become the Poets Against the War anthology. Before canceling the event, Laura Bush said that it was regretful that a literary event had to become political. It's worth reading, I think, A Monk's Tale, which is Hamill's essay reflecting upon the events surrounding his refusal. He recounts his overwhelming anxiety upon receiving the invitation from Laura Bush and goes on to say that he had to look deep within his conscience and, quote, practice a lifetime as a socially engaged poet. What I think is most telling about Hamill's reflection, and this isn't to dismiss his position or seriousness or anything like that, but there really is an underlying conservatism of his discourse, okay? In his invitation to poets to contribute to the anthology, he says that he asks poets to, quote, speak up for the conscience of our country. He also writes that, quote, a true patriot is born in the action of questioning and acting upon a reasoned response. So the problem is that the argument for refusal is really bound with the language of power that it seeks to refute. It appeals to the poet as a good citizen rather than the poet as revolutionary. And he has also said other things like you can't write about character in the human condition and be apolitical. That's not the kind of world we ever lived in. So just to balance that out a little bit. I do want to point out that his refusal has its own complications and in itself doesn't necessarily write with the language of nationalism, national identity. And I'm wondering now what it means for a poet to refuse the White House invitation for ethical reasons versus a poet who is invited to the White House and accepts it in an attempt perhaps to covertly critique power. Are we all writing for the White House whether we say yes or no? We are not so much interested, I think, in a poet like Billy Collins because with his blasé kind of passive language of empire, we can't conceive of his poetry ever functioning as critique. But we are interested, I think, in the avant-garde because we must feel on some level whether avant-garde resists empire or like maybe perhaps the futurist embraces it enthusiastically, that at least it has been more traditionally forcefully engaged in the political, and thus there is some expectation that it must carry out these traditions. An example of this assumption, I think, can be seen when in an interview with Kenneth Goldsmith, Dale Smith asked if bringing conceptual poetry to the Whitney betrays the radical impulse behind the avant-garde. So I'm going to move into talking about Kenneth Goldsmith a little bit. What do we do with a poet like Kenneth Goldsmith, and what is he doing reading at the White House? I think that in order to address these questions, we have to understand there aren't any easy answers. I don't have any answers. And I'm going to turn towards aesthetics as well, I think, because that's probably the best turn. And just try to think about the nature of the writing in general. So I'm going to use Robert Fetterman. Is he here?
I am.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm going to use your contention that conceptual poetry is allegorical. And as we all know, allegory is about doubles. So we're giving two things in one form, what is literally presented in the intended meaning. So in Notes on Conceptualism, Fitterman says that the allegory is, quote, writing of its time, saying slant what cannot be said directly, usually because of overtly repressive political regimes or the sacred nature of the text. If the former is the case, and certainly that we live in a repressive political environment is pretty inarguable, then one could make a case for Goldsmith's writing as covertly, quote, speaking truth to power through what Craig Owen refers to as the confiscation of images. Unlike a number of other literary modes, allegory is dependent on a public audience which seeks to persuade through coded language or signs. This allegory foreshadows the role of the audience and the audience's ability to grasp the real meaning of what is being said. I want to propose here that the conversation or allegory of Goldsmith's writing in the book, like Traffic, doesn't exist as much between the original text and the copy, but rather between Goldsmith's text and its new context, the new audience, reader, or thinker. I think those three things can be used interchangeably. who encounters his work. Because what seems to happen in this book is that the new context of the work, the double displacement from traffic report to text to reader encounter, is what makes the work amusing, interesting, and uncanny. In one direction, the text is twice delivered to the reader, first in the transient nature of listening to a traffic report, i.e. the pretext in the car in motion, probably in a hurry or otherwise in the real time of life, and then through the encounter with Goldsmith's text proper. But more importantly, the text is also delivered back to its origin by the reader, for the reader is brought back to this conceptual sort of capitalistic vertex, a kind of Platonic form of the traffic report, at once collective and individualized, located everywhere and nowhere in the public, in the flesh, and the poet, only to find that the origin has gone missing. Through the author's confiscation via formal constraint, the uncanny nature of the work is revealed, and could only be revealed through this medium of the copy, these texts, which takes us to a place of fleeting memory and horror that looks a lot like death or conception, or to use Goldsmith's language from Traffic, a torture test, gone at the very moment recognized. The inside-outside dichotomy, the dialectic, if you will, begins to be erased through the vehicle of the text. Thus, Goldsmith's work argues that the White House is everywhere, and there is no escape from this text or context to which we are chained, which I suppose is a sort of Derridian argument. The text seems to tell us to say yes or no becomes a stylized gesture. The place we are brought back to via copying or plagiarism, or whatever you want to call it, is as much a trick as it is mirage, as it is a construction and conceit. The whole process a kind of allegory. And maybe this is also what I find troubling about this sort of writing too. I guess we can talk about that. This is not to say that judgment or political decisions aren't important in Goldsmith's writing, but rather that the work of art need not do the judging for you, and in that sense it honors the reader. As Vanessa Place says, quote, "For an age when judgment suffers from spectatorship, the snapshot must be called into question." And this is where I think it is obvious but important to restate how the pretext and the copy very much destabilize notions of origin. These ideas are not new ones. A good concept to invoke here is that of mouvance, which is a concept formulated by Paul Zumthor, used to describe the subtle and sometimes large differences between copies of medieval manuscripts written in the vernacular. In the Middle Ages are full of anonymous authors or scribes who carefully transcribe the same stories and poems over and over again. Take, for example, there's a magnificent poem called Sir Orfeo, and the poem is a rewrite of the Orpheus myth. There's no author, no original text that we know of, but there are 3 manuscript copies of the poem that were copied by 3 scribes in 3 parts of England. The oldest one dates from 1330. And if one reads each manuscript closely and compares the 3, one realizes that there are changes that make each manuscript different. Particularly of interest are the ways in which the scribes make small changes to the text so that the text conform to the norms and mores of the particular culture, time, and place. Also noteworthy is the accumulative effect of errors and subtle changes in transcription that creates a way in which each text evolves from its unknown origin. What's important about Zumthor's concept of nuance is that the variation is linked to a lack of authorship. I think it's pretty easy to argue that text like Traffic lacks any specific or stable notion of authorship. Okay, just as traffic reports are decontextualized and recontextualized in Goldsmith's book, they're at once, they do, the same thing happens at the White House. While there's no overt political message in the writing, it doesn't mean that the work isn't dealing with the political in a radically new way. And so we have to look more at what the work is doing rather than what it's saying. When we look at the debased eye of the performer, reduced to mere parodying the public language of commerce and exchange. There's something disturbing, or I found disturbing, under this veneer of giddiness or silliness. And I was reminded of Shakespeare's Fool, who delivers encoded messages to the court, which are of course serious but can't always be heeded because the person to whom the message is being sent or delivered doesn't get it. But unlike the Fool, the language of Goldsmith's writing on some level need not be deciphered as well, so that both of those are at work. Okay, so and Golds, I didn't try not to read too many interviews because I thought they were a bit distracting for a number of reasons. Goldsmith did say in an interview that the real social space of conceptual writing is the conversation, and that made some sense to me. So I thought of the book Traffic as a kind of moral allegory or morality play, and just as in these medieval plays, there's a main character oftentimes who represents humanity or a social structure. Goldsmith brings through this formal constraint a kind of representation to his audience. Of course, the representation is us, and when we laugh at the performance, I think we shouldn't necessarily trust our own laughter because it might not be that funny, and he seems to propose that there isn't a way out of this hall of mirrors. The original text is gone and only existed in the most fleeting way, so we have to live in the textual mess that we've made. Still, I have to conclude this by recognizing there is a part of me that longs for the poet who goes to the White House to kick and scream and cause a big scene and break dishes. So maybe I want the poet to be invited to the White House, and then the White House finds out that the poet's a threat, and then the poet's uninvited, or maybe, maybe on some level, if that could happen, that it would suggest that resistance was offensive. I don't know, but maybe we have to work for a poetry that isn't welcome, to use Obama's word, at this White House or any White House, but that's all I've got, so thank you.
So when I find myself in a situation like this, I often appeal to the great Kevin Davies and quote from him, to imagine oneself a panelist. The idea of justifying an artistic practice gets on my nerves. Simply that so much of daily experience involves justification of one type or another, bureaucratic, economic, social, emotional, etc. I want artistic activity to have some distance from that, not freedom, perhaps, but, maybe a little. I'd like to read a comment of Tom Rayworth from the back of a recent book of his called Windmills and Flames. Tom says, "The poems have no intention, though their author is happy should others find them interesting to read. They will help the reader lose weight, have an attractive smile, be at ease with members of the opposite or their own sex, have relief from constipation, speak in tongues, fillet herrings, and ultimately boost the nation's economy." So I read this not at all as a devaluing of the work, but as a refusal to justify the poems in terms of any vocabulary beyond their own fact, and to leave the reader able to bring any vocabulary, experience, understanding, non-understanding, etc. to the book. In political terms, I would take this to be a radical democratic and/or anarchic stance, and I think that this is what the or a or an avant-garde is, a stance toward reality, or more exactly toward realities. With respect to the poetry, quote, poetry jam, unquote, at the White House, I feel generally that such events, whether at the White House or the Library of Congress or the Folger Shakespeare Library, also in Washington, D.C., etc., are to be ignored. that in a sense that's what they're for. To be ignored is in some sense their societal function. I'll quote Deleuze-Guattari from What is Philosophy? The function of science is to create new functions. The function of philosophy is to create new concepts. The function of art is to create new experiences. These events, such as the White House Poetry Jam, given the general aesthetic conservatism involved, are certainly not about creating new experiences. The poetics on offer at such events tend to be first-person narrative, free verse, lyric, with extremely normative vocabulary and grammar. This is equivalent to insisting on valuing only trad jazz after John Coltrane or Cecil II.
Who was it that way?
The inclusion, well, yeah, and Sonny Rollins too. The inclusion of Alison Knowles and Kenneth Goldsmith is an interesting phenomenon, but given the time strictures placed upon them, and I assume the White House vetting of what was to be presented and the otherwise aesthetically conservative lineup, not much of interest is being allowed to happen there, nor should one expect it to be. It is worth noting that the element of duration, primary to several of the works presented and to much avant-garde practice generally, is largely removed in both the Knowles and Goldsmith performances. We get only a bit of her long poem, The House of Dust, and really just a moment of her sound poetry invention, The Bean Turner, and of course the Whitman and Crane, as well as the two stanzas of Traffic that Goldsmith reads, are very short excerpts. Regarding the meaning of accepting such an invitation, I think it's hard to come to a conclusion on that. This is where it gets personal. I don't think I would accept such an invitation, not that I have to worry about receiving one. Simply, I would not be comfortable at that place in that company, so I wouldn't do that. On the other hand, I don't feel a need to judge Knowles or Goldsmith for accepting. Goldsmith is no more likely to refuse an invitation to the White House than Andy Warhol would have been. We're not talking about Sartre refusing the Nobel here. I mean, that such a refusal would not be an interesting or effective revolutionary gesture, I don't think, as she covered with the Sam Hamill. Nevertheless, this is where justification creeps back in, not artistically, but as a matter of citizenship. The issues of militarism, economic inequality, environmental degradation, human rights, corporate governance, etc., pose a very real moral dilemma for all of us that goes well beyond what happens at a poetry reading, whatever room that reading takes place in. And then, most successful nonviolent revolutionary actions can be seen as a collection of gestures or a collective gesture. Most successful avant-garde artistic activity can be seen as a collection of gestures or a collective gesture. No context is finite. Poetry, a body language. Power, a body language. So that's that.